Hi and welcome to another episode of Willys Garage, Norway. This is part 4 of my Roubo style split top workbench build series, where I am combining the two bench tops with a base and in the end leveling the top with a router jig. In part 1 you saw me designing the bench in Fusion 360. In part 2 you saw me start the build in real life by building the two bench tops, and in part 3 you saw me building the base. If you haven't watched those episodes yet and want to watch them, I will leave links in the description and also in the right hand corner info tag. There will also be links for most of the tools and other stuff I use on this project, so you can go and check them out. Before I can combine the tops with the base, I needed to assemble the base so I could use it to mark out where the mortises in the two benchtop halves was going. I clamped the base together and made sure all the corners and joints were square to each other using some 90-degree angles bought from banggood.com. Links in the description. When I was sure it all was square, I positioned the base and the bench tops in relation to each other, making sure the edges on the long side of the bench tops were flush with the edges of the base. This is important later on when I will add a legwise and bench dog holes. When everything was right, I marked around the edges of the leg tenons so I would know where the mortises was going. Then I dismantled the base again and found a hole saw that had the right size and made a punch in the middle of the mortise. Then I used a chisel around the edges of the marks just to prevent chip out when removing material inside. I also made a punch mark where the 12mm wood drill bit was going to remove materials in the corner. I made a mark and attached a piece of tape on the 12mm drill bit to get the right depth of the mortise. Using one of my 90-degree angles to drill the corners of the mortise by freehand, making sure to drill as straight as possible down to the depth mark on the drill bit. Repeating this on all four corners before drilling multiple holes along the edge of the mortise to remove as much wood as possible. Then I used a hole saw to make a hole in the middle of the mortise, and I had to drill this in 2 turns, removing the material in between with a chisel because the height capability of the hole saw. Now it was just a question of removing all the wood inside the mortise with some good old elbow grease, a hammer and a big chisel. This was quite time consuming. After all the mortises was made, I checked if the two H-frames fit correctly, which they did. A glue-up was imminent. I placed the frame on top of some wood boards just to get a bit more height. Later in the glue-up, off camera, I placed some higher blocks of wood underneath the forelegs to get room for all the clamps needed to glue everything together. The first thing I glued together was the long stretchers on the base. I added a lot of glue on the tenons and used my trusted old silicone brush to make sure the glue covered every surface. I placed the stretchers on one side and added glue to the other one before placing it on the other side. Fetching 2 of my workshop's longest clamps and clamped them together. Now I could add a lot of glue on 2 of the leg tenons and half of the short stretcher before maneuvering one of the bench tops on top. I didn't get it to fit at once, but with a little persuasion and raw force the bench top smacked down in its final resting place. After clamping the first bench top, I did the same with the other side, and that bench top needed even a bit more persuasion than the first one until it found its place. When clamping down the tops, there was a lot of glue squeeze out, which I tried to wipe away as best as possible during the glue up. I didn't use many clamps on this glue up, but I still think it looks like an art piece. After a couple of days, when the glue was dry, I wanted to use some heavy-duty wood screws to screw the middle of the bench tops down to the short stretchers. I used a washer on each screw and made the hole a bit bigger than the diameter of the screw, thus making it possible for the wood to expand and retract. The screw head was put inside the stretchers, so it wouldn't be visible. Now I could remove all the clamps, revealing a not so flush benchtop surface. Therefore, I had to make a leveling jig for my router. The jig was made out of some Finnish plywood. I just figured out the measurements for the jig while I made it, making sure the rail jig was wider than the whole workbench surface. The jig can be described like it's a straight rail for the router, so the router can manually be pushed back and forth along the straight rail, while you also move the rail incrementally over the surface you want to level. When the jig was finished, I used the router itself to make a slot for the router tool. Now I had to attach a straight piece of wood down along both sides of the workbench. It's important that these pieces are level because they are going to be the straight guide for the router jig you just made. I used some wood blocks to get the pieces of wood separated from the benchtop so I could use the router tool all the way over the edge. They got fastened with a couple of clamps while I made sure they had the same height up from the top of the base legs. To make sure that the two wood pieces was level in relation to each other, I made a mark on the same place in every corner. Then I attached a string diagonally between the corner marks. When done this way, the string crossing in the middle should barely touch each other if everything is level in relation with each other. After some fine-tuning, the strings looks good. Now it was time to start leveling the benchtops using a 20mm flathead router bit. I took off approximately 1mm on each pass. After the first pass you can still see that the tops are not level, so I had to take one more pass to get the top level. This was it for this fourth part of the Roubo style split top workbench series, and in the next part I will make the dowels and some benchtop inserts out of some salvaged African hardwood flooring. Maybe I also will apply some finish to the workbench. If you hit that subscribe button, maybe you will be here to see that. Meanwhile, you can get behind the scenes photos and info on my website, Instagram or Facebook page. Links down below. I would appreciate if you like, dislike or comment on this video. Okay, until next time, goodbye.